From the St. Francis Yacht Club in San Francisco, this is the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon, hosted by Ron Young.
Welcome to one of our Wednesday Yachting Luncheons. Beautiful to be here. Holy cow. So all of us who go sailing, and I'm going to be racing to San Diego, from Santa Barbara to San Diego in a couple of days. When we're out there in the ocean and we see, as you will in Santa Barbara, these giant oil rigs, and every now and then the inevitable happens, something breaks and oil splatters all across the water, the ocean. None of us do anything about it. I don't do anything about it except commiserate, worry, and fret over, holy cow, that big oil slick is hurting birds, hurting animals of all sorts. But there are people who do something about it, thank goodness. And those people who do something about it are represented by our speaker today. Actually, they sue, that is to say, EarthJustice sues offenders of any of the environmental laws that we have and oil spill causers, here's a word, and thank goodness that they do, because otherwise there's less monetary incentive to be careful with these gigantic oil rigs. So Brettny Hardy, our speaker today, graduated with a degree from Pomona and then went off to get 2 master's degrees at Duke, a law degree and one in environmental management. And we are lucky to have them here today because these folks help keep the oceans clean. So please welcome Brettny Hardy. Brettny, thank you for being here.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here. I appreciate you letting me speak about my work for a little bit and actually get to enjoy the ocean, which I don't get to do every day. So it's a pleasure to be here. And I can start just a little bit by letting you know what EarthJustice is, our organization, and what we do. I have worked at EarthJustice for about 12 years now. Like Ron mentioned, I went to Pomona. I originally got a science degree in biology and started out wanting to do marine science, and then realized that the law really is a powerful tool to make change, environmental change. And so I eventually got a law degree, and I started at EarthJustice in the Alaska office. I've been down here in San Francisco for about 9 years now. And EarthJustice originated in California. We were founded in 1971 as an arm of the Sierra Club, the Sierra Club Legal Defense Fund. And we were founded, or one of the first cases we brought was to protect a valley in California, Mineral King Valley, which is now part of Sequoia National Park. And back then, Walt Disney wanted to make a ski resort there. So we filed a case to protect the land. And after many twists and turns, we eventually established in court that the public has the right to go to court and protect the environment. And during that time, there were a lot of environmental laws passed, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act, which I'll talk a little bit about today. But these laws really don't mean anything if they're not enforced. And that's what EarthJustice is here to do. We're now about 250, more than 250 lawyers with a staff of over 500 people. And we are representing 500 or more clients across the country, ranging from national environmental groups to local community groups and individuals, tribes, and we don't charge for services. So we choose clients based on the fight rather than whether they can pay. We're located in 15 offices across the country, regional offices, including, of course, here in San Francisco, where we're headquartered. And all of the regional offices focus on doing work to protect the environment in their specific area. But there are also several program areas at EarthJustice which operate nationally. And I work in one of those program areas, which is the Oceans Program. And we work to promote sustainable fisheries and a healthy marine environment. We have been around for about 20 years, and we focus both domestically and internationally on protecting marine wildlife and ecosystems. We have altogether 10 lawyers working in the program, so there are 5 of us here in San Francisco, and then a couple up in Seattle, a couple on the East Coast, and 1 paralegal and several other advocates that work with us. And we focus on 2 things: protecting marine biodiversity and then combating climate change by fighting the expansion and unfettered growth of the oil and gas industry. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. So our mission in the Ocean Program, or one of our missions, is to really stop the expansion and growth of the fossil fuel industry offshore and usher in a just transition to clean energy. In terms of the climate, we really can't be serious about ending climate change without addressing offshore development. The U.S. Has made a commitment to slash greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2030, but we haven't so far taken any steps to limit oil production in light of this pledge. In fact, quite the opposite. The U.S. now is the biggest producer of crude oil in the world. So I'll say that again. The United States produces more crude oil than any other country in the world, and more crude oil than any other country ever has in history last year. So the Gulf also is a large source of this oil. 1 in 5 barrels of oil comes out of the Gulf, which doesn't sound like a huge amount, but keep in mind that most of the other oil that's being produced, a lot of it is on private lands, which is hard to get a handle on. But the Gulf oil is all on federal lands, and it's managed by the federal government. So it's the place that the government has the most control over and can actually make a big difference in terms of reducing emissions. So I'm going to talk about a little bit about the history of oil development and the ecosystems and wildlife and communities that are in the Gulf, and our strategy really in fighting this development, highlighting some of our current legal cases. So most of my time has been spent in the Oceans Program doing this work out in the Gulf of Mexico. And it's really a beautiful area. I'm sure many of you have visited. It's what someone in our Houston office likes to call the lesser-known third coast of the United States is the Gulf of Mexico. And it's one of the most productive ecosystems really in the world. It's kind of like the Yellowstone of the oceans, I like to say. It has a really biodiverse ecosystem. There are corals, mangroves, seagrasses, wetlands, hard and soft bottom communities, which all support a really diverse range of wildlife, from birds to thousands of fish and species, whales, and other wildlife all live there. So, for example, the Gulf is one of the main migratory stopping routes for many seabirds and other birds. It's also been found to be a nursery area for manta rays recently. It's the home of the northernmost coral reef in the United States, the Flower Gardens Marine Sanctuary, which is off the coast of Texas. And there are a number of populations of animals there that are unfortunately endangered or threatened, including what you see here up in the top corner, the Rice's whale, which is a whale that only lives in the Gulf. It was just recently discovered that it is a unique species that only lives there. It's a large whale about the size of a humpback whale, and scientists recently have been able to put microphones in the water to try to listen for them and discover, where they live and how many there are. It's estimated that there are only about 50 to 100 of these whales left in the Gulf. So they're the most critically endangered great whale in the world. There's also in the Gulf a really vibrant economy and culture. We get more than a third of our seafood from the Gulf in the US. There's also a lot of tourism. It's a big recreational destination. It's a huge part of the economy down there. And there are just a lot of unique, vibrant communities as well, including a lot of historic communities along the Gulf that were founded by formerly enslaved people. There's also tribal nations, including the United Hama Nation, which has been in Louisiana since before Europeans made contact and were displaced from inland parts of Louisiana out to the coast and have lived on the coast for a long time. And in the middle of all this abundance, there's also a very large footprint from oil and gas activity. So this just gives you a sense of what all is there and how much it covers. On the eastern side of the Gulf, there's not much oil and gas activity out there because there's a congressional moratorium. That area of the Gulf was originally removed from oil and gas activity to protect military training operations that were going on. And since then, the moratorium has been extended because the Florida delegation really doesn't want oil and gas in its backyard. So there's not as much activity there. But the western and central Gulf is full of oil and gas development. And this started back in 1938. The first offshore rig was constructed. It was only in about 14 feet of water and was about 300 feet high. And then it took a few years, took till 1947 for companies to actually drill a well to produce oil. And that well was located about 10 miles offshore. Since that time, there's been a lot of increased development, new technologies, and oil companies are able to drill now farther and farther offshore, up to over 200 miles offshore, which is pushing the limits of US waters, and in really deep areas. So now they go more than 10,000 feet in some places. And that's where really the remaining plays for oil and gas are. A lot of the oil in the shallower waters has been produced and is dried up now. So a lot of the bigger plays are out in deeper and deeper water, where it's, of course, riskier and riskier as you go deeper. And this map here kind of shows, in the green, those are the areas of land that have been leased to oil companies. So this is all public federal waters that I'm talking about, which is about 3 to 9 miles offshore, starting and then going out to 200 miles offshore. And that's all owned by all of us in the public trust. We all own it. And the government leases areas to oil companies. So these green blocks are lease blocks that maybe haven't been developed yet. And then the orange dots are platforms that are producing oil or have been built. And then the black lines are pipelines. So there are about 2,200 active leases in the Gulf of Mexico. Not all of them are producing oil yet, but they're actively being leased. That covers about 12 million acres and supports thousands of platforms. There are about 26,000 miles of pipeline, which if you laid them end to end would wrap around the equator. And about 20% of those pipelines were laid in the last 5 years. So that gives an indication of what direction we're going. There's still increased development going on. And this slide gives a better sense of some of the leases. So these are all the lease blocks. The ones that are in orange are producing oil. The ones that are in green and blue are leased, but they haven't yet started producing oil. So about 3/4 of the leases that have already been sold haven't yet started producing oil. They're going to start producing oil years from now, at a time when we need to be moving away from oil. And this development is continuing to increase. As I mentioned, we are now the largest producer of oil in the world and the largest producer in history. So in 2018, you can see the United States surpassed Saudi Arabia and Russia in the amount of crude oil we produce. And then just last year, we produced more oil than any country ever has in history. So we're not slowing down, in other words. And this just gives you another picture of the growth since oil production started in the US, which first was onshore and then offshore was added later. And it's still going up. On the very edge of the graph, there are some forecasted projections which show oil production continuing to increase even after this year going forward. And this gives you a sense here of how much of the oil is coming out of the Gulf of Mexico. So the top light blue is the portion coming out of the Gulf. Out of the 13 million barrels of oil that we produce every year, there are about 2 million barrels of oil that come out of the Gulf. A large majority of the rest is coming from private lands. Texas is the second, well, I should say Gulf is the second biggest producer or source of oil after Texas. Texas is the biggest. And the 2 million barrels of oil, of course, is still a huge carbon bomb in terms of annual contributions. So right now we're at a climate tipping point, and scientists are urging that countries stop the expansion of fossil fuels. But rather than phasing it out or even keeping it at the same level, of course, it's going up. And you all are, I'm sure, very familiar with the disasters that have started to happen and how the oceans are becoming hotter and more acidic every year. Just this year, there was an announcement of the 4th global coral bleaching event. And last year, the U.S. spent more than $92 billion on hurricane and other disaster relief. And climate warming is really impacting the Gulf significantly as well. So this shows how much wetlands have been lost in the Gulf, in Louisiana in particular. The areas in red are showing wetland loss areas. And the Gulf of Mexico is really vulnerable to sea level rise. In some areas, there's already been 8 inches of sea level rise, and there's lots of wetland loss. So land is just disappearing, basically. And this is because, in part, from the construction of pipelines, diverting soil, other construction activities, hurricanes, and specifically in Louisiana, there are some tribal lands on the coast and in the island where I mentioned the United Helma Nation has been living for a long time, and the lands are now being sacrificed to oil and gas. So those tribal communities in Louisiana are some of the first climate migrants, becoming some of the first climate migrants as their lands start to disappear. Oil and gas development, of course, creates a number of other harms, from spills, and I mentioned coastal erosion, all the way to downstream impacts. So after the oil is brought to land, most of the oil, of course, comes by pipeline. After it's brought on shore, it's refined in processing plants or turned into plastics. And those refineries and plastic plants, a lot of them are located, the vast majority, in the Gulf. And they produce a lot of pollutants. So you're probably familiar with Cancer Alley in the Gulf, where there are high rates of cancer and other diseases because these facilities typically locate in minority and poor communities, so a lot of environmental racism that happens. And I can talk a little bit more about the harms kind of stage by stage in the oil and gas process. So Oil and gas development usually happens offshore in 4 stages, starting with seismic air gun surveying, and that's what's used to try to find deposits of oil and gas on the seafloor. And then companies will go out and drill exploratory wells. Eventually, when they locate the oil, they'll start drilling for production and producing oil. And then once the platform or the well has reached the end of its lifetime, there should be a decommissioning process where the well is plugged up and the platform is removed. And the production lifetime of a well can be long, 40, 50 years, a lot of times in the Gulf. And so once a well is being produced, it can produce oil for decades. Unfortunately, the decommissioning step hasn't been happening as frequently as it should. So in the Gulf, in California, in fact, this is happening with these older platforms that are down in Southern California. They've reached the end of their life, and they haven't been decommissioned yet. So there's a lot of abandoned infrastructure in the Gulf. So going back to the first step, which are these seismic air gun surveys, that's how the companies will search out and discover oil deposits in the seafloor. And what they do is there'll be these large ships, and they carry lines behind the ship, which have air guns attached to the lines. And these lines go out for miles, and they have like 50 to 100 air guns attached. And then the air guns will send out huge blasts of sound, which bounce off the seafloor and then are received back up by the ship so that companies can see what's underneath the sediment and find out where the oil and gas deposits are. And so these can be harmful to marine life if they're really right up next to the air guns. They can be deafening or cause physical injury, but more than that, the sound really travels so far in water. And so you don't just have one of these boats operating. There are 50 to 100 of these boats operating every year in the Gulf, covering the same area, crisscrossing, and it makes for a very loud underwater, especially considering all the other vessels and container ships and traffic that's making noise. So whales and dolphins are the big sufferers. They are not able to communicate as well with all that noise, or to find food, or to reproduce. So it's making it hard in their ecosystem with all of that noise going on. And then once a company is starting to explore for oil and then produce oil out of a well, there's of course lots of other harms that can take place, including spills. There's air pollution from venting and flaring on the platforms. There's waste products, cuttings that are deposited, sewage, other waste products that are left in the ocean. There are anchor chains that can tie up things, ship strikes, all kinds of other things that can happen. And then there are the unplanned environmental harms that come from oil and gas development offshore. I'm sure all of you know about the BP disaster on Deepwater Horizon that happened in the Gulf in 2010. And that was on a well that was owned by BP, and they were drilling in about 5,000 feet of water. So when the explosion happened, when the blowout valve that is supposed to close the well failed, it was really hard to cap the well because it was in such deep water. And so the spill eventually released 130 billion, I think, I have to get that right. 130 million gallons of oil, and had really devastating effects for wildlife. So the Rice's whale that I mentioned that lives in the Gulf lost about 20% of its population. A lot of impacts to whales and dolphins. Sperm whales, which are also present in the Gulf and are endangered population, lost about 7% of their population. And then there were severe human tolls as well. So there was loss of worker life on the BP well itself, and then economic loss. The Gulf lost about $247 million just in the fishing industry alone. And this is not the only spill that happened in the Gulf. There are smaller spills that happen every day, or not every day, but often throughout the year. There are a number of smaller spills that happen that are not quite this large, but can be really large in size and cause continuing effects for wildlife and for the ecosystems there. So this is where we step in, and we bring litigation to try to protect these Gulf ecosystems. And when I say that we litigate to protect the Gulf or to stop oil and gas drilling, a lot of times people think we're suing BP or Chevron directly. But remember that what we're talking about are federal public lands that we're focusing on. And the government okays everything that happens on these waters. So the government manages them, gives permits, and we are going after the government. So we want to make sure that the government is not issuing these permits without the environmental protections that are needed, or without looking at what environmental mitigation is required. And we look at these decisions that the government is making. This is usually the Department of Interior manages offshore oil and gas development, specifically the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management at the Department of Interior. And we look at these decisions from start to finish. So there's a multi-stage process that takes place, starting with what's called the 5-year program. And that's a program that the Interior Department puts out every 5 years. And that lays out a schedule for the lease sales or auctions that they're going to hold over the next 5 years. And then after that, and we participate, I should say, a lot in the advocacy for these programs, and sometimes go to court to challenge those. But after the 5-year program is developed, the government will hold lease sales, and those are offering up for auction new areas of the Gulf for oil and gas development. And we focused on challenging these lease sales for the last almost decade. Since 2016, we've challenged every lease sale that the government has offered. And we've had some successes. So this is one example of a case we brought in 2021. At the beginning of the Biden administration, there was a very large lease sale that was offering a little more than 80 million acres of land in the Gulf for sale. Not all of it is sold, but all of that was up for auction. It was the biggest lease sale, offshore oil and gas lease sale in U.S. history. And the area in the eastern Gulf, of course, was not part of that, but everything else that hadn't been leased or was available to lease was offered at that time. And so we challenged the government's decision to hold that lease sale because they hadn't looked at the impacts on climate. They hadn't considered what are going to be the climate impacts from this sale and from the drilling that's going to result on these lease areas, and how is that going to affect our ability to meet our commitments and to reduce emissions. And we actually won. So we won in court. The court agreed that the government had not considered the climate impacts of that lease sale. And the court ended up revoking all of the leases that had been sold, which was really a great victory. Unfortunately, about a year later or so, the Congress passed the Inflation Reduction Act, and one of the provisions in that act mandated that all the leases that had been sold go back to the companies. So we weren't able to create lasting change, but we were able to get victory for a short while. There is still obviously leasing going on, and so we're still challenging lease sales. We're still in court trying to stop the bleeding, I guess you could say, stop from this expansion of oil and gas activity. So putting aside what we need to reduce on existing production, just stopping the new activity from happening. And then in addition to that, we often will bring cases at the later stages of the drilling process, which after there's a lease sale, then a company will, they have to submit an exploration plan, it's called, to the Bureau and get that approved before they can go in and drill a well. And then they also have to later on submit a production plan and get that approved before they can drill a well. And so at the later stages, we're also in court trying to protect animals and ecosystems. One example of that is a case we have trying to protect threatened and endangered species in the Gulf. And if you remember, there are a lot of endangered species down there, including all 5 species of sea turtles that are either threatened or endangered. And the government typically, in order to protect these animals under the Endangered Species Act, it's required to analyze any action that's going to be taken and determine whether there's going to be harm, enough harm that would jeopardize the existence of these threatened or endangered species. And then the government has to put some measures in place that will stop that harm from happening so that the animals are protected. And they usually do this by writing what's called a biological opinion. And the National Marine Fisheries Service, in this case, is responsible for the biological opinion for marine critters. And after Deepwater Horizon happened, of course, there were big impacts to all these endangered and threatened species in the Gulf, including, and these include whales and dolphins. Several species are endangered or threatened. Some rays and sharks, some fish species, some birds, and the sea turtles. And the Fisheries Service had written a biological opinion years ago, but after Deepwater Horizon happened, they failed to update it to really look at, what's changed? How did this spill affect these animals? And we took them to court and finally forced the agency to update their opinion. Nearly 10 years later, in 2020, they wrote a new biological opinion. Unfortunately, that opinion was inadequate. It didn't have the protections needed. So, for example, the Rice's whale I mentioned, which is the large baleen whale that's really critically endangered in the Gulf, the government determined oil and gas activities are the biggest threat to the species and will put them into jeopardy. But they didn't put into place any measures to reduce the harm from these activities. And so we went back to court to challenge the new opinion that the government wrote. And we were successful in part because the government has agreed to rewrite that opinion and do a better job. And they are in the process of doing that. In the meantime, we reached a settlement with the Fisheries Service that required them, they agreed to put into place some interim protection measures. While they were in the process of rewriting the biological opinion, they agreed to put into place some protection for Rice's whale in particular. And this kind of shows you where the Rice's whale lives, where the Rice's whale habitat is, this area that goes through the Gulf. And we know they live throughout this area, again, because of the microphones that scientists have now placed off the coast of Texas. And we now know, actually, just this year, we found they go down into the Mexican part of the Gulf of Mexico because scientists put some microphones down in some sites in Mexico. But in the habitat, there were a couple of lease sales last year that happened. And so the government agreed not to offer areas for sale that were in the habitat. And then they also agreed to put into place some speed restrictions. So ship strikes are a big threat. And a lot of the oil and gas activity requires vessel support to bring in crew and to bring in supplies. And so a big threat from the vessels that are supplying these platforms is the speed that they're going. And so the government agreed to require these vessels to slow down when they're going through Rice's whale habitat. Unfortunately, the industry challenged these interim measures in court last year, and a court in Louisiana agreed with industry, or they won, and they were able to remove these protections. So the lease sale that happened in December offered for sale areas that are in Rice's whale habitat. So you can see, this is lease sale 261 was the last one that happened in December. And it shows you some of the dots where some areas were offered in Rice's whale habitats. And the speed limits were removed, so they weren't required as part of the sale. So we are back in court challenging, we reopened our challenge to the biological opinion that exists, that the one that is in existence until the Fisheries Service writes the new one. And we're hoping we can get some protections in place more permanently for Rice's whale and other species. And as these cases illustrate, there's a lot of ups and downs in these cases. It's a big roller coaster. So even when we win, it doesn't necessarily hold up in the long term. But we're still going to fight, and we're still going to bring these cases, even though it doesn't immediately result in victory. It shifts the conversation, and it creates change, even if it's a little slower. And sometimes there's big changes. You never know. To leave on an up note, the Interior Department released its latest 5-year plan last year, and that's the schedule of leases that it's setting for the next 5 years. And it only included 3 lease sales, which is still a lot of lease sales. We wouldn't want any to be in there. But it's the least number of lease sales they've ever had, and it's less than what they had originally proposed, which was 11 lease sales in total. And so now there are only 3 lease sales planned in the Gulf over the next 5 years, and hopefully we can convince the government to cancel or minimize those lease sales to the extent possible. But just to leave you too on anything you can do to help, if you're interested, on our website we often try to post public comment periods if they're open to comment or to submit petitions. An easy thing you can do is just follow us on social media or sign up to get emails. And if you're really interested, you can support our work and enable us to continue this fight through donations. So thank you. Thank you very much.
Wow. So you guys are busy.
Yes.
So 250 lawyers on EarthJustice. How many lawsuits do you think you file per year?
Oh, that is a great question. I wish I knew the answer to that. We file more lawsuits, I can tell you, than any other public interest environmental group. More than the government. We're in court, so quite a few.
Quite a few. We're talking about 100, 200?
I would say in that range. I don't know for sure.
So now, some may know my oldest daughter is a lawyer, very successful young lawyer, and she went to the client side after having been a partner at Davis Polk and a couple other silk stocking law firms because she didn't want the whole concept of billable hours. She said it put me at odds with best interests of my clients often. She said sometimes she could come up with a solution in 10 minutes, but that wasn't making the CFO of the law firm happy. So now you guys, you live on the contingency side of the world. How do you get revenue into EarthJustice?
Sure. So we don't charge attorney's fees, and we don't have typical billable hours. A lot of our work is made possible through donations and endowments, and it's really what is the backbone of our work. We also do sometimes, we are able to recover attorney fees in some cases if we win from the other side. But
damages, you'll get
no, not
legal fees. Okay.
Not punitive damages, but there's a statute that allows us to recover the fees of our work. So the attorney's fees that we would have been charging if we weren't a public interest organization.
So are you a 501c3 or what's your status on the tax statutes?
I believe so, yes, 501c3, yes.
Okay, and so are there times when you actually ask for and win punitive damages?
There are times when we win a case and we will seek attorney's fees just for our fees for the hours that we've worked and the costs, like the filing fees or costs of travel that we've accrued. And we will seek those from the other side, usually the government. And then a lot of times we'll negotiate those, and if we've won, the government will give us some portion of those fees.
What's the average judgment size you guys win?
So we don't usually win judgments. It's more just covering. So if we win, it's not usually the typical punitive or penalty fees that we would get or penalty money that we would get. It's just those fees. And it depends on how long the case has been going on. So what we'll do is we'll calculate all of our hours, calculate all of our costs. And if the case has been going on for years and years and we win, then the fees can get quite high. But it would probably be in the low hundreds of thousands, maybe, would be for a case that's been going on for a long time.
If you were inside the firm, what's the biggest victory you've had?
Personally, the biggest victory was actually the one I mentioned, which was the case we brought against the lease sale that took place in 2021. And that's because usually it's difficult to actually stop the sale from happening because you would either have to get an injunction, which requires a showing of pretty high harm. And the courts haven't before vacated the leases that were issued. So that was the first time we were able to successfully challenge a lease sale, and the court actually erased the lease sale results. So vacated, invalidated or voided the leases that had been sold. And that really had a big impact, because if you don't void the leases that are sold, what usually happens is under the Administrative Procedures Act, which is the statute that governs the government's operations, basically, a lot of times the action that the government takes, so the lease sale, the decision to hold the lease sale, would go back to the government, and they may fix something, and then it's resolved, and the lease sale just goes on and nothing is different. But in this case, because the court actually vacated the leases, it was a huge victory. And it's reflected in, the congressional action that took place afterwards, because it really impacted the players, and there was a big push to get those leases back.
So the victory was you stopped a lease that could have enabled oil drilling in a whole large area. So
Exactly.
How did you get paid for that?
My salary is mostly from our staff salary is mostly from donations at
Okay.
EarthJustice. Yeah.
And how much are donations per year?
Oh gosh, I need to have studied our books more. I don't know, but I could look, and that's a great question.
So now, can you sue polluters? Do you, as a practice, sue polluters outside America, internationally?
We do have an international program. It's not, so the folks that focus on international work, what they do most often is they'll partner with an environmental organization in another country. And usually that organization is challenging activity in that country. Like in South Africa, we partner with some environmental groups down there who are fighting companies who are trying to start oil and gas drilling and do seismic surveys off the coast of South Africa. And so we will usually just consult with those organizations and support them in their efforts a lot of times.
So who was the oil company that you were opposing in this big lease victory you had?
So we don't actually ever sue oil companies directly because the oil companies, the only reason that they're able to drill and to produce oil in the Gulf, everything that happens in the Gulf is because the government okays it. And so we don't sue the oil companies directly, we sue the federal government.
Okay.
And in that case, we're suing the Department of Interior, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, that approved the lease sale and did the environmental review for the lease sale before it happened.
How many lawyers do they have compared to your staff?
The government is pretty equal. I will say that a lot of times industry groups will intervene to defend a decision that the government made because they're benefiting from it. And so there are lawyers a lot of times on the other side who are intervening on behalf of like Chevron or American Petroleum Institute. And so usually we're just fighting directly against the government, but there can be industry lawyers.
The Department of Interior?
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So now, are they as fierce as Chevron or Exxon?
Sure. Yes. The Department of Justice is very well versed. Of course, there are a lot of smart lawyers there, and it just depends. Sometimes there may be political decisions factoring into how they defend a case, but yeah, usually they're tough cases to win. Yes.
So you said your biggest success was this series of oil leases that you got that you stopped. What's your biggest failure?
Oh gosh, I don't want to talk about that. No, let's see. I don't know. Failure. I don't know that I look at it in terms of failure because we're always learning.
Where were your biggest lessons?
Biggest lessons. Good. Yeah. I think. One I mentioned early on when we were challenging these lease sales, we weren't making a difference because we weren't able to get the leases stopped. And so I think we learned a lot of lessons about how to proceed and strategies we can use to actually stop the leases from going forward. I think a lot of times there's challenges, especially in the courts. It's really hard to win arguments when the government is making factual decisions because typically the courts will give the government a lot of deference. They're the ones that they're the experts in the field theoretically, and so the court oftentimes will give a lot of deference to the government when they're making factual or scientific decisions. If we're fighting about what's the best science or if there's a better study they should have been using, a lot of times those can be really difficult fights to win, and we've lost on those.
Can you feel a difference in the government's arguments based upon administration? Does it seem it's easier to win cases when you have a Democratic administration driving the Justice Department, or is it tougher when you have a Republican administrations? Can you feel it?
No, not at all. I think that both administrations defend. The Department of Justice is there to defend the government's permit making and decision making. So they fight hard to defend those decisions no matter what.
What's the value? How much tax revenue do we get from these leases? What's a typical year, and how much does America get from leasing these big tracts of oil drilling rigs?
We do earn royalties once an area is leased.
We meaning the government?
The government, yes, which comes back to us, I guess, in some form eventually. But yes, the government, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, I think a lot of their budget comes from royalties that are earned on leases. So once a lease is producing oil, the companies do have to pay royalties to the government. And there are profits from lease sales when the leases are sold as well to the government.
So now, it seems like you're specialized in these particular oil industry activities. Do you pay attention to pollution coming down rivers that comes as well? And do you have legal actions to stop polluters from dropping plastic in the rivers that come down into the Gulf of Mexico?
We do have lawyers at EarthJustice who work on the Clean Water Act, so the Clean Water Act is pretty unique in that it allows citizens to challenge polluters directly. You can go after a polluting company and take them to court and tell them to stop dumping stuff in the water and charge, seek penalties from the companies that are polluting. And we do have lawyers that work on the Clean Water Act. I don't do that personally. The statute that I work under is usually it's called the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act, and it doesn't have a similar citizen suit provision. So we can challenge decisions that the government makes using the Administrative Procedures Act, which allows citizens to challenge government decisions, but we can't go after the polluters like the oil industry directly using that statute.
So the lawyers who are arguing on behalf of the government, how often do they change sides and come over to your side? How many of your employees are former, government lawyers who used to argue against your side?
There is a lot of crossover, and there are EarthJustice lawyers who now work for Department of Justice or work for Fishery Service or work for the Bureau. And there are lawyers who have worked for the government who now work at EarthJustice, which is so it's nice you get to know people some, and there's lawyers that you go up against that you get to know as well, and usually it's very cordial relationship, and so there is a lot of crossover.
Sharks don't usually eat sharks, right?
Right. We're the good sharks, though, right?
So these oil rigs, you mentioned the number. How many oil rigs are there in the Gulf?
How many platforms
Yeah,
are there?
platforms. Yeah.
I don't know the exact number. They're in the thousands.
And what's this? How many employees are in any one of these platforms? Give us a sense of the scale of these things.
Oh gosh, they're getting bigger and bigger. So I think Shell,
like 500 feet by 500 feet, or what?
Oh geez, I don't know exactly, but there are some that are smaller and shallower waters. I think in the deeper waters they're getting bigger and bigger, just so it can support people over a period of time. But I think Shell opened one of the biggest platforms recently. I don't know the size of it or the number of people that work there. It's a good question. I should investigate.
So what are the most common offenses? Are they oil spills, or are they acoustic damage from the air guns? What's the most common offense that you're wanting to avoid? Or stop?
Yeah, right now our big focus is trying to reduce emissions, climate emissions, because such a large chunk of our emissions are from fossil fuel production. And so that's a big focus. That harm is probably our biggest focus. But aside from that, a lot of times the environmental review that the government does, if they don't look closely enough at the seismic noise that's happening, that can be a harm that we'll challenge. Or if there is a spill, it's a different story, but usually we're looking at the review that the government has done and whether they've adequately assessed what potential spills could occur and factored that into their decision making.
So now my mother's side of the family came west from Oklahoma in the Great Depression, and they left tons of oil exploration in their tracks behind them. And lately we've been watching how where there's lots of oil exploration, there's also an increase in earthquakes because of big holes that are hypothetically underground. Mm-hmm. Are we seeing more earthquake activity underneath the bottom of the ocean, under the Gulf, because of oil exploration?
Not that I know of. I think the biggest impact really is the sediment diversion that has happened because of construction for oil and gas pipelines and platforms, other construction as well on levees and things that down in the Gulf that have diverted soil and caused the erosion to happen faster. So they're losing a lot of land right now. I haven't I'm not aware of any earthquakes.
So John, if anybody else has a question, I'm going to keep asking questions until I see a curious listener. What's the life cycle of these oil rigs, the average oil rig? How long are they?
Yeah, it takes about 10 years from when a company will buy a lease for them to actually start producing oil, 10 years or more, because you have to survey the area, find a well, find the oil, and then...
So after they get the lease, 10 years of startup before they start pumping.
Right,
Okay.
and then once they start pumping oil, it can be up to 50 years a lot of times, depending on how much oil is there.
What percent of all the drills out there are for fluid oil and what percent are for gas?
The vast majority in the Gulf are for oil, excuse me. There used to be more gas activity off the coast of Texas in shallower waters, but most of the activity now is for crude oil, and a lot of the gas comes from land in the Permian.
We have a question from our very articulate staff commenter, Bruce Monroe.
Yes, thank you, Ron. Being a little parochial, we live on a great waterway here, not the Gulf of Mexico, and this yacht club owns an island up in the California Delta area. And Southern California water interests want to make a huge tunnel up on the Sacramento River to divert water from that river and the Delta area to Southern California. I'm wondering if your organization is involved because there's a big environmental fight going on over that tunnel.
Okay.
Are you involved with that?
I don't know off the top of my head, but I can find out. There are a number of lawyers in the California office who, I know they were involved in like the Delta Bay fights that took place a while back. So they may be involved in the one you mentioned. I'd have to check though. I don't know off the top of my head.
We actually had a speaker here, Ron, you probably remember, a couple of years ago, a lawyer who has litigated with them, but it's still going on. I just saw in the paper the other day that Governor Newsom has come out in support of this tunnel, but the locals, including those of us who enjoy our Tinsley Island up there, have fought this thing tooth and nail. And
what are the environmental impacts going to be? Is it...
Oh, the digging up of the river, just an enormous tunnel that would start up in the Sacramento River north of the Delta. Then the tunnel would go underneath the entire Delta and come up again south of the Delta and then pump that water to Southern California.
Wow. Okay.
So that would have a major environmental impact.
10,000 barge trips to end the dirt that gets drilled in the 40-foot diameter tunnel he's talking about. 10,000 tug trips with barges to get the soil taken someplace.
Wow. Okay.
Dredge spoils. So, Kathy, if you could look up total revenue the U.S. government gets from oil leases, that would be kind of productive, if it's possible. So talk about your typical work day. What do you do, typical work day?
Typically, a lot of it is spent researching and writing and talking to people on the phone, calls, a lot of it on Zoom because I'm working with people across the country. Sometimes I'll get to be on the water, not very often, as much as I would like. And sometimes I'm in court, but I'm not in court as often as you would think because these cases, the administrative cases, a lot of it is decided on the papers. So you don't get to appear in court very often. I enjoy going into court, but I don't get to do it as often as I'd like. Yeah.
Dick has a question.
Yes, thank you, first of all, for your talk and also more for the work you're doing. There's a department of the government called the Environmental Protection Agency, and I have to believe that some people in that agency are kind of on your side in some of these issues. So when these leases come up for negotiation, do they get a say in restricting the number of leases or arguing on behalf of the environment? And if so, can they continue to make that case alongside you in court, or are they gagged at that point and said, shut up, the government's made a decision and it's up to them, up to the Department of Justice to defend it?
Yeah, sometimes the other agencies like EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, or the Fisheries Service will submit comments, critiquing some of the environmental analysis, and we can use those comments in our arguments, but they don't act as a partner in any other sense. And the EPA, they do issue water permits, so they will issue water permits for some of the waste that I've talked about, but they don't manage the air pollution from the platforms. The Bureau actually manages the air pollution in the Gulf, so they're not as involved in offshore activities, and they don't have a say in the planning process, like in the leasing and the whether to approve the production plans, for example. They don't have a direct say under the law, but they can comment. Yeah.
Yes, another question.
Hi, thanks so much for your presentation and for the work you do. I wanted to ask, it makes total sense what you said about the legal work and Justice Department doesn't change that much from administration to administration. The laws are in effect, the judges are who they are. But as a policy, from the policy perspective, I'm wondering, to the extent you feel comfortable, if you could give an assessment of Deb Haaland and, what's been done publicly and what's behind the scenes and how you feel. So she's Secretary of the Interior, First Native American. Wondering your assessment and what you think she might do in another 4 years, with another 4 years.
Yeah, I think there've been a lot of really great. I think there've been a lot of progressive actions that have been taken by the Interior Department. Not as much in the oil and gas space. So I think that they have protected land in Alaska, for example, which has been really important, and they've issued some really innovative rules that govern the development of oil and gas on land. And this is the Bureau of Land Management manages oil and gas development on land, which is a separate agency, but it still falls under Secretary Haaland. And so there have been a lot of great things. I think in a second term, I think it would be really important to stop new leasing. And their hands have been tied to some extent because in the Inflation Reduction Act I mentioned, there's also a provision that says that if you want to issue wind leases, you have to have an oil and gas sale. So that's another really, important thing that the Interior Department has done is shepherd the development of offshore wind and clean energy. But this provision in the Inflation Reduction Act doesn't allow them to keep focusing on that priority without having an oil and gas lease sale. So I think getting rid of that provision would be really important and stopping new leasing. And I think there are some things that the Bureau can take. There's some actions that the Bureau and the executive can take to slow the rates of production in the Gulf, and that would really impact emissions. They also have never really assessed like how much emissions are coming out of the Gulf and what would they need to do to get those emissions in line with climate commitments. So kind of assessing that and maybe evaluating their approvals based on, how much emissions are there? Can we approve another well, or do we have the capacity to release more emissions? And kind of making decisions based on that would be helpful, or other environmental factors. And there are actions that Secretary Haaland could take to remove areas from leasing. There's a statutory provision that allows the government to withdraw areas like in the Eastern Gulf. So just withdraw them entirely from leasing, and that's something they could do as well. Yeah.
Well, Brettny Hardy, a lawyer for EarthJustice, thanks very much for sharing your insights with the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon.
Thank you.
Meeting's adjourned. Thank you. Wow. You basically got-
Oh, thanks.
This has been a presentation of the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon.